I'd like for you to imagine your favorite place to get a book. So this might be a nice little independent bookstore with overstuffed cushions and somewhere you can drink a cup of tea and peruse the stock. Or it might be a chain bookshop, or maybe the library, your local library. Or maybe you just pick up books when you're going off to holiday somewhere. Grab whatever best-selling paperback is at the airport and go with that. Now I'd like you to imagine if tomorrow you walked into your favorite place to get books and there were no names on the books. You had no idea who had written anything that you were about to read. As it happens, I live up in Scotland and there is a bookshop that does this. It's in Scotland's national book town of Wigtown. And they wrap up books in brown paper, tie it with a piece of string, and write a couple of words maybe on the outside of the paper to let you know what you're in for, but you literally can't see what the name of the book is or who's written it. And I've got one with me today. And let's see what we've got wrapped up in brown paper here. Bit of string. Now, when you don't know who the author is, how do you decide if a book is worth reading, if this storyteller is really going to take you away? Most people who are browsing books will turn to the first couple of pages and see if it grabs them. So I'll go to the first page in here and just tell me whether you think this is going to be a good book. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. Obviously, that's the opening to Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, and it's one of the most famous opening lines in English literature. But what not a lot of people realize is at the time she was publishing her books, which were bestsellers even then, they were published under the pseudonym of simply a lady. She was effectively anonymous to all but a very small group of people around her. Very often when we talk about anonymity, or you see it in the press, people talk about the negative side. They never really ask, what are the positives? What motivates writers to want to use pseudonyms, to want to be anonymous? Why would Jane Austen need to be anonymous? She's a fantastic writer. I mean, she was loved by no less than the Prince Regent himself. And part of the reason has to do with the fact that she was a woman. As Virginia Woolf famously put it, anonymous was a woman. This isn't always the case, as we'll see, but it is very often true. And certainly in the society that she was writing about, where she herself was somebody who needed to marry and to marry well, to try to live up to the expectations that her family might have. Perhaps being known as a very sharp and witty and sometimes acerbic writer about her own culture would have prevented that. Now, obviously, we know a lot about Jane Austen now. You can go to Bath, you can go on a little Jane Austen tour, you can see the little table where she wrote her books out longhand. But if you were one of the first generation of readers of her books, you knew none of this. You only could trust the tale. I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the reasons why people choose anonymity, and some of the authors that have been anonymous and what their fates were. But I think it's very helpful to tell you a little bit about myself. I was an anonymous author. I started writing a blog under the pseudonym Belle de Jour in 2003. It became a series of books and then a television show, and I was still anonymous for 6 years. Now, in that time, there was no shortage of people who thought that they knew who I was. And every single one of them was wrong. There were forensic linguistic professors brought over from the States to claim that I was an already published author named Sarah Champion. There were people who thought I was Toby Young. There were people who thought that there was a group of writers at the Erotic Review who were doing this to boost the sales of their own magazine, which I was writing for at the time. In 2009, I became aware that somebody had given my real name to a Sunday newspaper. And, well, you know the reputation of the tabloid press in the UK. I knew that this was a problem that was not going to go away. So I decided to beat them to the punch. I outed myself, and obviously this is a photo of me with Billie Piper. Now, she played me on television before she really knew anything about me, so she didn't know I was a scientist, and that the reason why I started working as an escort was because I had done, as so many generations of people do, is move down to London and expect the streets to be paved with gold, and expect jobs to just fall into your lap out of the sky. And of course, when that didn't happen, and my money ran out very quickly, I was left with some choices that some people might find unpalatable. She also didn't know that I'm really American, as you can tell from my broad Southern accent and flashy boots. The origins of anonymity are pretty much as old as any recorded writing we have. I'm going to talk a little bit about anonymity in ancient Greece, but I'd actually just like to pop ahead to Imperial Rome for a second to give an example of why an author would need anonymity. So the poet Ovid, he was quite an urbane man, a Roman citizen, had never been in the countryside in his life. He wrote something that offended the emperor. And we don't actually know quite what it is, but you can sort of piece together evidence that suggests that Ovid wrote a poem in which there was a single line kind of questioning the chastity of the emperor's daughter. For his pains and what he called this grave error and mistake, he was sent to the furthest reaches, to the absolute country bumpkin nowhere of the Black Sea, which, as painted by many painters, looks beautiful and lush, and there are women milking mares and lush green hills, and there's Ovid, very cosmopolitan, in his robes, looking like somebody just weed in his cornflakes. This was to him, to somebody who made a living recording and also sometimes satirizing Roman society, the worst of the worst. For him, this was worse than death, to be absolutely removed from all of his material and all of his inspiration. But of course, there were many anonymous authors before then, and very often in the classical world, anonymity is not so much a choice as just a condition of existence. It isn't necessarily always important to know who wrote certain stories and tales. So we have, say, Aesop's fables, which are supposed to have been written by a slave. Some even suggest that it was written by a black slave. But we can probably guess that there probably was no one-person Aesop, and rather these sort of homespun tales of morality were put together in a kind of package that would inspire people to take them seriously. Here is some down-home wisdom for you. This is why you should listen to this tale. This is one of the things that anonymity does very, very well. It can take something that's very general and make it personal. It can also take something that's very personal and generalize it. And then also, of course, we have the Homeric Epics. And it's fairly well accepted by most scholars of Homer that it was not one person, that it was many people, and that really we're talking about a style of epic. Now, I love Homer because when you look at the Odyssey, there are just so many layers of anonymity working their way into it. So we have the author who is effectively anonymous because we have no direct evidence of his life or who it might have been, or even if it was more than one person. But also within the tale, we have Odysseus. Now, after the Trojan War, Odysseus was headed home and he got a bit lost. He is a man of extreme ego, and physical skill. He lands up on an island where there are Cyclops, and he and his men are attacked and eaten by these. He tries to exact his revenge on a particular one called Polyphemus, who asks him, "What's your name?" And he tells him, "My name is Nobody." So that when Odysseus later attacks him, he shouts out, help me, other Cyclops, come and help me." And they say, "What's happening? Who's attacking you?" And he goes, "Nobody's attacking me." And they go, "Well, all right, never mind then." Now Odysseus and some of his men get away. They get in the ship, they get out on the sea. But Odysseus cannot resist looking over his shoulder and revealing who he really is. He wants to claim success under his true name. So he shouts back, "I am Odysseus, ha 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 ha, take that." What he perhaps hasn't fully appreciated, of course, is that Cyclops was the son of Poseidon, the god of the sea, and they're now in the sea. So Poseidon's not really pleased about this. And he brings storms and he sweeps them off course. They have all kinds of adventures. So that's fail number one for Odysseus for anonymity. At some point, they land up on an island, and Odysseus meets a princess, Nausicaa. And she takes him back to meet her parents. As you do, this complete stranger washes up. That's totally the logical thing. And he, shows himself to be very physically capable. He plays some games. He out-wrestles everybody. The king and the queen put on a giant spread, a banquet for their honored guest, because Odysseus has refused to tell them his real name. "Dear honored guest, please enjoy this roast ox," or whatever. After dinner, somebody comes out to entertain the banquet and to tell tales of the Trojan Wars. Now, Odysseus was there. He knows the story, or rather, he knows how the story should go, and he's getting more and more and more angry because this dude with the music is getting it wrong. So he starts to object. He speaks up. "No, this is not what happened. This is not what happened. Let me tell you what really happened." And it's at this point his hosts go, "Oh, come on, now tell us who you are really. No man is anonymous. No man is without a name." And that is the first instance that we have in writing in the Western tradition, and where we get the term anonymous. So there's quite a lot to unpack when it comes to Homer and when it comes to this condition. Now, as time goes on, and certainly in the English tradition, there is a very long period in which the writers of texts are generally unknown. This doesn't necessarily always mean that they didn't sign their work, but perhaps it didn't survive, because there may not be very many copies left. Or something got recopied, something got appropriated, something got put into a scroll or a book grouped together with other people's works, and it all gets muddled up. Because it was more important for the readers at that time to know the tale than to know the biography of the person who wrote it. This sort of starts to change in English around the time of Chaucer, who is in a lot of ways your first kind of blockbusting superstar author. He was sort of the Stephen King, J.K. Rowling, 50 Shades of Grey of his time. Fewer whips. But there are people who continued to choose anonymity, who really didn't necessarily want the kind of attention and the kind of culture of celebrity that was just starting to emerge at that time. You've also got a parallel tradition of people who are tricksters, people who claim anonymity or use pseudonyms because they're trying to get away with something, which brings me to probably my favorite French poet of the Middle Ages, out of a field of one. Actually, there's more than that, but this is the one I like. This is Villon. Now, we don't actually know his real name. We know that he was imprisoned for a time for possibly stealing some gold from a church. He may have killed some people, he was the lover of several bishops, and he actually stole his name from his lawyer. So we actually know him by his solicitor's name rather than his own. Now this woodcut, I think, is really very telling. This appears in the front of some of the manuscripts, because with one hand, he's waving at you, it's like, oh hey, and with his other hand, he's reaching for his dagger. This is a man who carefully crafted pseudonymity and anonymity as a kind of armor to sell his stories. And the poetry, when you read it, is just full of pathos and memento mori, and also just very, very dark humor. He wants you to come into his world, but he doesn't necessarily want you to get too close to him. And of course, there are echoes much later on in the 20th century with O. Henry, the famous American short story writer. Kids in the States all read him at school, particularly The Gift of the Magi, which is about a very poor couple, a woman with long hair who sells her hair so that she can buy for her husband a watch chain. Meanwhile, her husband is selling his watch so he can buy her some combs for her really long hair. O. Henry had a criminal background. He did not want this to intrude on how people received his writing, because it might overtake how people read it. Now, you might think to yourself, surely if you're trying to establish yourself in the literary world, you don't really need to hide yourself. But he felt that was the case. Obviously, there are the women who wrote under male pseudonyms, such as the Brontes. And in France, we've got the laws that prevented women from publishing under their own names unless they had the specific permission of their husband or father, and thus George Sand. Thomas Paine, whose political writing sparked two revolutions, one in the States, one in France. Alexander Pope and Jonathan Swift, who went to such lengths when they wanted to publish anonymously, they would get other people to write out their manuscripts so their printers wouldn't recognize their handwriting. It was kind of the InfoSec of its time. And then John Twynne. Now, this man was not himself anonymous, but he was tortured and then hanged for protecting the anonymous author in the 17th century of what was considered a seditious pamphlet. James Weldon Johnson, 20th century American author, who anonymously published the memoirs of an ex-colored man and talked about something very uncomfortable, which was what it was like to be mixed race passing as white. And finally, probably my closest contemporary, both thematically and time-wise, Melissa P., who was a teenager from Catania in Sicily, who wrote her sex memoirs at the tender age of 16. And 2 years later, she outed herself because she was tired of being accused of being someone else. You might ask yourself, when it comes to anonymous people, how can we trust what they write? How do we know what they're writing is the truth? But actually, a name tells us nothing. It tells us only what that person wants us to know about them. An anonymous person can always trick you, because that wasn't Jane Austen. That was one of my own books. And the real first line of the book is, the first thing you should know about me is that I'm a whore. Or, as D.H. Lawrence put it, never trust the teller, trust the tale. Thank you.